Listen. The cicadas go silent all at once, the way they do when something moves through the grass that should not be there. An engine ticks as it cools. A church lamp hums over an empty lot, and a man kneels in the dark beside his truck, hands folded, eyes open, no longer breathing. That morning, he had come here to beg for help. All at once, the way they fall silent when something moves through the high grass that should not be there. One moment, the August night was thick with their droning, a sound so constant that the people of Belhaven, Texas, had long ago stopped hearing it at all. The next moment, nothing. A silence with weight to it. A silence that pressed against the ears the way deep water presses against a swimmer who has gone down too far. In the parking lot of the Living Vine Family Church, only the small sounds were left. The tick, tick, tick of a truck engine cooling in the dark. The electric buzz of a tall lamp flickering above 4 acres of empty asphalt. And far behind the towering glass doors, muffled by concrete and distance, the last swell of 10,000 voices singing a song about being washed clean. The man sitting against the front tire of his truck did not hear any of it. His name was Daniel Cobb. He was 49 years old, and that very morning, he had been alive and healthy and badly afraid. People would remember the afraid part later, when they tried to explain how a man with nothing wrong with him came to be dead in a church parking lot without a single mark on his body. You could see the church from the interstate, 6 miles out in either direction. A cross of polished gold, 30 feet tall, lit from below so that it seemed to float against the wide, black Texas sky. It was the kind of thing that made tired families slow down and take the exit. It promised something. It promised that whatever was broken in your life could be mended here, that whatever you had lost could be returned to you, pressed down and running over, if only your faith was large enough. Daniel Cobb had believed that promise once. He had believed it with everything he had. The last service of the night let out a little after 10. The doors opened, and the people came pouring into the warm dark, still humming, still glowing, car keys jingling, children half asleep on their father's shoulders. They flowed around the rows of parked cars like a slow river finding its way home. None of them noticed the man by the old gray truck at the far edge of the lot, where the good lights gave out and the shadows began. Why would they? He was only sitting. A man sitting in the dark, resting, the way a tired man rests. It was 2 ushers doing the final sweep of the property who found him. They were young, both of them, college boys in matching polo shirts, and they were laughing about something as they crossed the asphalt. Then one of them stopped laughing. He had seen the way the man was sitting, and something about it had reached into his chest and closed a cold hand around his heart before his mind could put words to it. Daniel Cobb was kneeling, not slumped, not fallen. He had come to rest on both knees in the narrow space beside his truck, his back straight, his head lifted, his eyes open to the night sky. And his hands were folded in front of him, folded carefully, deliberately, palm to palm, fingers laced, the way a child is taught to fold them before a meal, the way you fold them to pray. His face was the worst part. Later, neither usher would be able to describe it to the police without their voices going strange. It was peaceful, calm, a small, faint, contented smile, as though in his final moment, Daniel Cobb had been shown something wonderful. It was a peaceful face, and it sat on top of a body locked rigid in the cold August air, and the wrongness of those 2 things together was a thing the young men would carry for the rest of their lives. The cicadas were still silent. Inside the great glass building, in a private room behind the stage, a woman named Ruth Vance was gathering her things to go home. She was the pastor's wife, and she had been the pastor's wife for 34 years. and she had learned in that time how to feel a change in a room before anyone said a word. She felt it now, a draft that came from nowhere, here in a building sealed tight against the heat. A smell underneath the lilies and the floor polish, faint and sweet and somehow spoiled, like flowers left too long in their own water. She stood very still and waited for it to pass. It did not pass. It deepened. When the call came up from the parking lot and the security men went running, and the careful machinery of the living vine began the quiet work it always did when something threatened the picture of perfection it sold, Ruth Vance walked out a side door and stood at the edge of the lot and looked at the kneeling man before anyone could stop her. She looked at his folded hands. She looked at his lifted face, and a single thought rose up in her, unbidden and certain and terrible, before she pushed it back down into the dark place where she kept the things she did not allow herself to know. She thought, he was here this morning. He came to ask Caleb for help. The coroner would rule it natural. Heart failure, he would write, in a healthy man, in a kneeling posture, with a smile on his face. There would be no investigation. There would be no questions, because the living vine did not permit questions, and the Vance family least of all. But Daniel Cobb had walked into that church one last time, on the last morning of his life, and he had been told something, and whatever it was, no one inside those golden doors would ever say it out loud. 3 days later, the living vine did what it always did when death brushed too close. It threw a party. The occasion was the church's 35th anniversary, planned for months, and Caleb Vance was not a man to let one dead stranger in a parking lot dim the lights of a celebration. So on Sunday morning, the great room filled to its 10,000 seats. The band roared. The fog machines breathed their pale clouds across the stage, and out of the white light strode the pastor himself, arms wide, smile bright as the cross on the highway. He was 58 years old, and he wore it like a man half that age. Silver hair swept back, a suit that cost more than most of his people made in a month, a voice that could drop to a whisper and still reach the last row. When Caleb Vance spoke, the room leaned toward him. He had a gift. Everyone agreed on that. What they did not agree on, because most of them never saw it, was what lived underneath the gift. He told them that morning about seed faith. It was the heart of everything he sold, and he sold it beautifully. God was not poor, he said. God was a king, and a king blessed his children. And the way you opened your hands to receive a blessing was to first plant a seed. You gave, and it came back to you 100-fold. The bigger the seed, the bigger the harvest. He did not say that the harvest only ever seemed to grow in his own fields. He did not say that families drove home from these meetings with their bank accounts emptied and their faith stretched thin as paper. He smiled, and he asked them to give, and the buckets went down the rows and came back heavy. In the third row, where the family always sat, Ruth Vance folded her hands in her lap and did not look at the buckets. She had not told anyone what she had thought in the parking lot 3 nights ago. She had pushed the thought down, the way she had pushed so many things down across 34 years of marriage, into the quiet locked room inside her where she kept everything she could not afford to know. Daniel Cobb. She knew that name. She had heard it years ago in this very house, spoken low behind a closed office door. She made herself stop remembering. There was a skill to not remembering, and Ruth had spent half her life learning it. Beside her sat Jesse, the elder son, 32 and already a smaller, harder copy of his father. Jesse ran the business side of the ministry, and he ran it the way a man runs a machine he intends to feed for the rest of his life. He had his father's smile and none of his father's caution. Where Caleb knew to hide the hunger, Jesse let it show in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. watching the buckets, watching the numbers on the big screens in the back office, watching the empire he would one day own. His little boy, Eli, 6 years old, sat swinging his feet against the chair and drawing quietly on the back of a program. And Jesse did not look at him once. And on the far end of the row, as far from his father as the pew allowed, sat the son who had come home. Micah Vance was 28, and he had left this place 4 years ago, and he had sworn he would never sit in this room again. He had meant it. He had built a small, ordinary life 2 states away, a life with a wife he loved and a baby on the way, and a faith he had to rebuild from the ground up after this house nearly broke it. But Caleb had called, and Caleb's calls were not easy to refuse, and so here he was, in a borrowed tie, watching his father work the crowd and feeling the old sickness rise in his throat. His wife, Hannah, sat close against his side. She was 27, 7 months along, one hand resting always on the curve of her belly. Her faith was the quiet kind, the real kind, worn smooth and warm from honest use. She had never liked this church. She liked it less now. She leaned to Micah and whispered, "Why did he really call us back?" And Micah, who had been asking himself the same thing, had no answer to give her. The service ended in triumph. It always did. That evening, the family gathered at the great house on the hill, the mansion the ministry had paid for, all glass and pale stone, and long, silent halls hung with framed magazine covers of Caleb's face. There was a dinner, catered and cold and joyless. There was wine. There was Caleb at the head of the table, talking about expansion, a second campus, a television deal, his voice filling the room the way it filled the auditorium. And there was Jesse nodding along, and there was Micah saying nothing at all. It was Eli who noticed it first. The boy had wandered from the table, the way children do, down the long hall toward the dark end of the house. And then he came back, slowly, and he stood in the doorway with his drawing held against his chest, and he looked at his grandmother with an expression that did not belong on the face of a 6-year-old. The grandfather clock at the end of the hall had stopped, he said. All the hands were pointing straight up, and there was a smell coming out from under the door of the locked room, the one nobody was allowed in. A smell like flowers, he said, like old flowers in dirty water. Ruth Vance set down her glass very carefully so that no one would see her hand had begun to shake. The air conditioning clicked off a little after 3 in the morning, and the great house on the hill went perfectly still. Ruth lay in the dark with her eyes open. Caleb slept beside her the way he always slept, deep and untroubled, a man whose conscience never once kept him awake. She listened to the silence settle over the house, room by room, and she waited for the small, ordinary sounds that would tell her the world was as it should be. The hum of the vents, the tick of the grandfather clock down the hall. The vents were silent, and the clock, which Eli had sworn was stopped, had begun to tick again. But it was wrong. The rhythm of it was too slow, and then too fast, and then it stumbled, like a heart that has forgotten how to beat. She got up. She told herself she was going to check on the boy, who was sleeping over in the guest room because his father had been too busy and too drunk to drive him home. That was a reason a person could say out loud, but her feet did not carry her toward the guest room. They carried her down the long, dark hall, past the framed magazine covers of her husband's smiling face, toward the door at the end. The locked door. The room that only Caleb had a key to. The room he called his study, where he kept the things a ministry like theirs had to keep and could never let the world see. The smell met her halfway down the hall. Eli had described it perfectly, the way only a child can. Old flowers in dirty water. But there was something underneath the sweetness now, something the boy had been too young to name. It was the smell of meat that has begun to turn. It was sweet, and it was foul at the same time, and it grew thicker with every step she took, until she had to breathe through her mouth to keep from gagging. The cold came next. 3 feet from the door, she walked into it like walking into a wall of water. The hall behind her was warm with the held heat of a Texas August. The air in front of the locked door was winter. Her breath fogged. The hair rose along her arms. And in the gray light that fell through the hall window, she saw that something was lying on the floor at the foot of the door, pushed halfway out from underneath it, as though it had been slid through from the other side. It was a cloth, a square of white linen, folded into quarters, the kind the ministry mailed out by the thousands to anyone who sent in a large enough gift. An anointed prayer cloth, they called it. Touch it to your need, the letter said, and plant your seed of faith, and watch what God will do. Ruth had stuffed envelopes with these cloths herself long ago, before the operation grew too large for the pastor's wife to touch. She knew she should not pick it up. Every animal part of her, every old and honest instinct told her to turn and walk away. Instead, she knelt, there in the cold, in her nightgown, and she lifted it. It was heavier than cloth should be, and it was stained. In the dim light, the stain looked black, but she knew, the way you know a thing in your bones, that in daylight it would be the deep brown red of old, dried blood. The cloth had been soaked in it once and left to dry, and folded into the center of it, pressed flat, was a small square of paper. She unfolded it with fingers that had gone numb. There was a name written on it, in a shaking hand, in ink gone faint with time, and beneath the name, a single line. The name was Daniel Cobb. The line read, "I gave you everything. Give me back my son." Ruth's mind reached for the meaning of it and could not hold on. Daniel Cobb had no son. Or did he? There was so much she had taught herself not to know. She knelt there with the bloody cloth in her hands and the dead man's name swimming before her eyes. And she became aware, slowly, the way you become aware of a sound that has been there all along, that she was not alone in the hall. The cold had a weight to it now, a presence. It stood just behind her left shoulder, close enough that she should have felt breath on her neck, except that whatever stood there did not breathe. She did not turn around. She could not. She knelt frozen, staring at the door, and in the black glass of the framed photograph hanging beside it, the photograph of her husband's beaming face, she saw the hallway reflected behind her. She saw herself, small and white in her nightgown, and she saw, rising up out of the dark at her back, tall and thin and wrong, a shape that should not have been there. It was kneeling, just as she was kneeling. Its hands were folded as if in prayer, and where its face should have been, there was only a pale smear, tilted, watching her, wearing the faint, contented smile of a man who has been shown something wonderful. The clock at the end of the hall stopped ticking, and then it was simply gone. The cold and the weight and the thing in the glass, gone all at once, like a held breath let out. And Ruth Vance was alone on her knees in a warm, dark hallway, clutching a folded cloth that was no longer stained at all, that was clean and white and ordinary, as though she had imagined the whole of it. But the paper was still in her hand. The name was still there. And from the other side of the locked door, soft and patient and unmistakable, came the sound of something settling, as if it had waited a long time and could wait a little longer still. Jesse Vance did his best thinking in the money room. That was what the staff called it when he was not around. Officially, it was the data center. a windowless suite on the third floor of the ministry headquarters where 6 enormous screens tracked everything that mattered. Online giving, television pledges, merchandise. The slow, steady river of cash that flowed in from 100,000 open hands and pooled, in the end, here, under Jesse's watchful eye. He loved this room the way other men love their children. He came here late, when the building had emptied, and he stood before the glowing numbers and felt something close to peace. That night, the numbers would not hold still. He noticed it first on the central screen, the big one that showed the day's total. The figure flickered, dropped to 0, climbed back. He frowned and tapped the console, blamed the network, and the moment passed. Then the room went cold. Not the manufactured cold of the air handlers that kept the servers happy, but a deeper cold, a wet cold, the kind that comes up off a river at night. His breath showed in front of him. On all 6 screens at once, the numbers stopped and held, and rearranged themselves into something that was not a number at all, but a name, repeated, column after column, top to bottom, in characters he could not look at directly. Then it was gone, and the screen showed the day's total, healthy and climbing. And Jesse Vance stood alone in a warm room with his heart going hard against his ribs. He poured himself a drink from the bottle in his desk and told himself it was the stress. The dead man in the parking lot had rattled everyone, that was all. Bad for business, a thing like that, right before the anniversary. He drank and he steadied, and by the time he drove home, he had already begun the work of forgetting, which was a thing the men of his family did very well. Across town, in the guest room of the great house, his brother was not forgetting anything. Micah had not slept well since the dinner. Something about that night had lodged in him like a splinter. His mother's shaking hand, the boy's story about the smell, the locked door he himself had been forbidden to open as a child. And under all of it, the name nobody would say, Daniel Cobb. A man had died on the family's doorstep, and the family had thrown a party. That was not grief. That was a thing people did when they were afraid of what grief might dig up. So Micah did what his father had taught all of them never to do. He asked questions. He started with the obituary, which was 3 lines long and listed no cause of death. He found a local news item, buried 2 paragraphs. A healthy man found dead at a megachurch, ruled natural. No further comment from the living vine. And then, because the name would not let him go, he searched it further back, years back, and he found the thing that turned the splinter into a blade. Daniel Cobb had given a son to this church. Not a son in the way Micah had first read it, a real son. A boy named Aaron, 19 years old, who had died 6 years ago. The news from back then was thin and strange. A construction accident on a church building site, a settlement, a family that had once been comfortable and was, within 2 years, bankrupt and broken and gone quiet. And not one word in any of it from Pastor Caleb Vance, who had stood at the dedication of that very building and called it a house the Lord had built. Micah read it 3 times. Then he went to find his mother. He found her in the kitchen at the gray edge of evening, alone, washing a glass that was already clean. He said the name out loud, gently, the way you set down something heavy. Daniel Cobb. He said, "Did you know he had a son who died?" He said, "Mom, did you know?" Ruth Vance dropped the glass. It shattered in the sink. And she stood looking down at the pieces, and she did not move to clean them up. And Micah saw on his mother's face a thing he had never seen there before. Not surprise, recognition. The look of a person hearing a door open that they had spent years nailing shut. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. but her voice had no floor under it. "You do," Micah said, quietly. "You know exactly what I'm talking about." For a long moment, she said nothing. The water ran, the broken glass glittered, and then she lifted her eyes to his, and what was in them frightened him more than anything had frightened him in that house, which was saying a great deal. "There were others," she said, so softly he almost did not hear it. "Before the Cobbs, after them. Your father has a room full of them, Micah. Names. I never let myself count." She turned off the water. She dried her hands on a towel, slowly, as a woman does when she has decided to stop running from something and does not yet know what running toward it will cost. "There is a folder," she said, "in the locked room. I have seen the outside of it 100 times and never once opened it. It has a name on the tab in your father's handwriting, and I have spent 11 years pretending I never read that name." "What name?" Micah said. Ruth looked at her son. Then she looked toward the dark hall, toward the door at the end of it, where something had knelt behind her in the night, and smiled. "The folder is labeled Harvest," she said. "After that night, the prayer cloths began to appear. The ministry mailed them out by the truckload, so at first it was easy to explain. One turned up folded on Ruth's pillow, white and clean. Another was tucked into the pages of the Bible on the nightstand, marking no verse in particular. Hannah found one in the nursery bag she had packed for the baby, pressed flat beneath the tiny folded clothes, and she did not remember putting it there. And when she lifted it to the light, she saw the faint brown shadow of an old stain at its center, like something that had been washed out and would not wash out entirely. She showed it to Micah with shaking hands. He took it from her and felt the cold come off it, the river cold, the same cold his mother had described. He did not tell Hannah that. He told her it was nothing, a stray bit of mail, and he carried it out to the trash and buried it deep. In the morning, it was back in the nursery bag, folded exactly as before. Micah stopped sleeping almost entirely after that. He spent his nights at the kitchen table with a laptop and a legal pad, pulling at the thread his mother had handed him. He could not get into the locked room. He had tried the door twice, late, and both times the cold had risen up to meet him before his hand even touched the knob. And both times he had heard, on the other side, the soft, settling sound of something shifting its weight, and he had not been able to make himself try the lock. So he worked from the outside instead. He found the others the way you find rot in a house, by following the smell. A widow in Abilene who had mailed the ministry her late husband's life insurance and died 8 months later, alone, of nothing the doctors could name. A young couple who had given their savings to plant a seed against their daughter's illness, lost the daughter anyway, lost the house, and then lost the husband to what the obituary called a sudden passing. A retired pastor from a small church the living vine had swallowed whole. Found in his garden one morning, on his knees, with his hands folded and a smile on his face. On his knees, with his hands folded. Micah read that line and put the laptop down and went and stood at the kitchen window for a long time, looking at nothing. They were not all like that, but enough of them were. Enough that the shape of it could no longer be called coincidence. Somewhere in the locked room, in a folder his father had labeled Harvest, was the ledger of it all. And Micah understood now that what he was looking at was not a series of tragedies. It was a pattern. It was a debt being collected, one family at a time. And his father had been collecting alongside it, profiting from the very grief that the thing in the house fed upon, and the family was next. He felt that with a certainty he could not argue away. Whatever this was, it had come home now. It was in the walls. It was in the nursery bag. It had stood behind his mother and smiled, and it was patient, and it was not finished. It was Eli who told them how close it had come. The boy had been staying at the great house more and more because his father was drinking more and more, and the great house was where his grandmother could watch him. He was a quiet child to begin with, and he had gone quieter still, and he had taken to drawing the same picture over and over, which he would not explain. A tall, thin man, all in black lines, kneeling, hands together, a wide, flat smile that went past the edges of the face. One evening at dinner, in the ordinary way a child says an extraordinary thing, Eli looked up from his plate and spoke. "The smiling man comes to my room at night," he said. "He kneels by the bed and he watches me sleep, and he smells like grandma's flowers. He doesn't talk, but last night he wrote something on the window with his finger in the fog. He wrote it backwards so I could read it from inside." The table had gone very still. Ruth's fork was halfway to her mouth. Micah set down his glass. Hannah's hand moved to her belly. "What did he write?" "Sweetheart," Ruth said, in a voice she fought to keep level. Eli thought about it. He was not frightened, which was the most frightening thing of all. To him, the smiling man had become as ordinary as the furniture. He wrote a name. Eli said, and then he wrote next. He pointed his finger at the name like he was choosing, the way you choose at the ice cream counter. Then he smiled bigger and he pointed at the door, like Daddy was coming, even though Daddy wasn't there. "Whose name?" Micah said. His own voice sounded strange to him. Eli picked up his crayon. He turned over his drawing, the one of the kneeling man, and on the back, in the careful, blocky letters of a 6-year-old, he wrote it out for them. It said, "Jesse." And underneath, in the same patient child's hand, copying exactly what he had seen written backwards in the fog on the glass, it said, "He gave the most." Outside, all at once, the cicada stopped. Micah brought it to them on a Tuesday because he could not carry it alone any longer. He had spent 4 days assembling it after Eli's drawing, 4 days that had aged him a year. He printed everything: the obituaries, the bankruptcy filings, the little gray news items that no one had ever connected because no one had ever had a reason to look. He laid it all out across the long dining table where the family had eaten its cold, joyless anniversary dinner. Page after page after page, until the white tablecloth was covered and there was no room left for a plate. Then he called them in: his mother, his brother, and his father. Caleb came last, in his shirt sleeves, a glass of iced tea in his hand, with the easy, unbothered air of a man who has never once in his life been afraid of a piece of paper. He stood at the head of the table and looked down at his son's work, and he did not flinch, and he did not pale. And that was the first thing that told Micah how bad it truly was. "You want to tell me what this is?" Caleb said. "It's them," Micah said. "It's all of them. The families who gave you everything and then died. I found 31 so far." 31. Dad, going back to the year you started this church, some of them lost their money. Some of them lost their children. And some of them were found on their knees in their own yards, with their hands folded and the smile on their face. Exactly like Daniel Cobb. Exactly like the thing that has been in this house for 3 weeks, watching your grandson sleep. He was breathing hard by the end of it. The room was silent. Hannah had her hand pressed to her mouth. Ruth stood by the window with her arms wrapped around herself, looking at the floor, having heard already, in the kitchen, the smallest part of this, and dreading every word of the rest. Jesse spoke first, and his voice cracked down the middle. "This is insane," he said. "People die, Micah. Old people, sick people. You take a church this size, of course some of the people who give to it are going to die. That's just numbers. That's just statistics. You can't actually believe." But he could not finish it. Because he had seen the screens go cold. He had seen the name written in the columns where the money should have been. And his own son had written Jesse on the back of a drawing of a kneeling man. And Jesse had not slept right since, and the denial died in his throat because some animal part of him already knew it for a lie. Caleb set down his iced tea. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. It was lower. It was the voice he used in the quiet part of a sermon, the part where 10,000 people leaned in, and it filled the dining room the way it filled the auditorium. And it was, somehow, the most frightening thing Micah had ever heard. "You think I don't know?" Caleb said. The words landed like stones into still water. He looked around the table at his family, and there was no fear in his face, and no guilt, and that absence was a horror all its own. "I have always known," Caleb said. "I knew before any of you were born what this work costs. You think a thing this size grows on prayers and good intentions? It grows on seed. And seed has to be planted in the ground. And the ground takes what it takes. And that is not cruelty. That is harvest. That is the oldest law there is. Some are planted so that many may grow. I made my peace with that a long time ago." "You killed them," Micah whispered. "I saved thousands," Caleb said. His eyes were perfectly calm. "I built a house where 100,000 people come to meet God. Do you understand the math of that, son? Do you understand what a few are weighed against so many? And before you stand there in my house and judge me, you remember that I am a man of God. I am washed. I am covered. Whatever was required of me, it was required, and it has been forgiven, because I have given my whole life to his work, and he does not abandon his own." He believed it. That was the thing Micah could not get past, then or ever. His father was not a man wrestling with a secret sin. His father had looked at the deaths of 31 families and decided they were the price of doing God's work, and had gone on smiling in the front row every Sunday, certain to his bones that grace had covered the whole black account. Ruth turned from the window then. Her face was wet, but her voice, when it came, was steady and quiet and final. "It doesn't work that way, Caleb," she said. "I used to believe it did. I used to believe a thing could be true on Sunday morning and undone by Sunday night. But there is something in our house that came up out of all that ground you planted, and it is not interested in your sermons, and it does not care that you tithe. It has been counting too, and it has counted further than 31. "How do you know that?" Micah said. Ruth looked at her husband's locked study down the dark hall where the folder labeled Harvest had sat for 11 years. "Because I finally went and looked at the tab," she said. 31 is what you found from the outside, Micah. The folder inside that room is 4 inches thick. By morning, Caleb had a different name for it. He had not slept on the 4-inch folder. He had slept the sleep of the righteous, and he had risen with a sermon already forming in him. And when he gathered the family in the great room of the house, he stood before them transformed, no longer cornered, but commanding. A general who has correctly identified the enemy at last. "This is an attack," he told them. His voice rang off the glass. "Do you not see it? We are the largest gospel work in 3 states. We are about to break ground on a 2nd campus. We are reaching more souls every single week than most men reach in a lifetime. And precisely now, precisely at the hour of our greatest harvest, the enemy comes against us. Of course he does. He always strikes the anointed. What you are calling a curse, son, is nothing but the devil throwing everything he has at a family God has set apart. Micah stared at him. "You think this is the devil attacking you?" he said. "Dad, those people are dead because of what we did to them. We did nothing but preach the gospel of increase," Caleb said, "and we will not be moved by fear. Fear is how he gets in. We do not retreat, we advance. We bind this thing, we rebuke it. We cover this house in the blood, and we plant a breakthrough seed so large that heaven itself has to answer." And so the machinery turned, the way it always turned, toward the only solution Caleb Vance had ever believed in. By noon, the prayer warriors had come, 24 of them, the inner circle, the ones who traveled with the ministry and ran its deliverance services. Men and women with anointing oil in little vials and scripture memorized like armor. They walked the halls of the great house, anointing the doorframes, pressing oily thumbprints over every threshold, calling out and declaring and decreeing, their voices rising into a wall of sound. Russell Bishop, Caleb's right hand for 30 years, directed them with the cold efficiency of a man running a stage production. Because that, Micah understood now, was exactly what it was. Jesse fell apart somewhere in the middle of it. He had not been right since the money room, and he was worse now, gray and sweating and flinching at shadows. And when the prayer warriors began their work, he clung to it like a drowning man clings to anything that floats. He prayed louder than any of them. He pressed oil to his own forehead until it ran into his eyes. He grabbed his brother by the collar in the hallway, and his breath was sour with whiskey and terror. "You have to stop saying it's our fault," Jesse hissed. "You hear me? If it's our fault, then we can't fix it. And Dad says we can fix it. Dad says if we just believe hard enough and give enough, then it has to leave. That's how it works. That's how it's always worked." "It has never worked," Micah said. "Look at the folder, Jesse. 31 families believed and gave, and it didn't save a single one of them. The oil isn't going to save you. The seed isn't going to save you. The only thing that gets us out of this is the truth, the whole truth, out loud, and giving back every cent we took." Jesse let go of him as though he had been burned. His eyes were wild. "Don't," he whispered. "Don't you say that in this house." And he backed away down the anointed hallway and went to stand among the prayer warriors, where it was loud, where a man did not have to hear his own conscience. That night, they held the service. They cleared the furniture from the great room, and they lit the candles, and the 24 warriors formed a circle, and Caleb stood at the center in his white shirt with his sleeves rolled and his Bible open in his palm, and he began. He had done this 1,000 times. He knew the rhythm of it, the build, the crescendo. He called the thing out by every name he had for it. Spirit of fear, spirit of death. He commanded it to flee. He declared the house cleansed. The warriors pressed in, hands raised, the sound swelling, and Caleb's voice rose over all of it, certain, triumphant, sure of his authority as he had been sure of it every day of his life. And the house listened. Micah felt it happen. Standing at the back with Hannah's hand crushed in his, he felt the temperature begin to drop, degree by degree, against the heat of all those bodies and all those candles. He saw his breath. He saw the candle flames lean all together, all in the same direction, away from the center of the room, as if something at the center were inhaling. The smell came up through the oil and the smoke, sweet and spoiled, and it grew until it smothered everything else. The warriors did not notice at first. Caleb did not notice. He was too deep in the performance, eyes shut, hand raised, decreeing victory into a room that had gone wrong around him. It was Eli who noticed. The boy had been put to bed upstairs, but he stood now on the landing in his pajamas, looking down through the railings at the circle of swaying adults, and his small, clear voice cut through the noise like a blade through cloth.
"You're doing it wrong," he called down to them. "He doesn't want you to make him leave."
The praying faltered. Heads turned up toward the child on the stairs. "He likes it," Eli said. "He's kneeling too. Look. He likes it when you all get down on your knees." For one moment after Eli spoke, nobody in the great room moved. Then Caleb opened his eyes, and he did the worst possible thing. He took the child's warning as a challenge. A lesser man might have faltered. Caleb Vance had never once in his public life backed away from a room that doubted him, and he was not about to start in front of his own warriors. He raised his Bible higher. He raised his voice louder, and he drove the service forward into the cold like a man spurring a horse toward a fire. "Get it out," he roared. "We do not bow. We do not kneel to it. In the name that is above every name, I command you, leave this house." And the room became a thing Micah would spend the rest of his life trying to forget. The candle flames stretched sideways and went blue. The 24 warriors, swept up in the noise, began to weep and shout, and some of them went down, not in worship, but in collapse, folding to the floor as though the strength had been pulled out of their legs from below. The cold deepened until the windows fogged from the inside, and the smell, the sweet and rotten smell, grew so thick that Hannah turned and was sick in the corner, and Micah pulled her back toward the door, and over the heads of the swaying crowd, he saw it. At the center of the circle, just behind his shouting father, the air had gathered itself into a shape, tall, thin, kneeling. Its hands were folded in front of it in mocking imitation of every raised hand in the room. And where its face should have been, there was the pale smear and the wide, flat smile. And it was looking at Caleb's back with what Micah could only describe afterward as patience. It was not afraid. It had no reason to be. It knelt there in the middle of the man's great show of power, and it waited, the way a landlord waits at the door of a tenant who is already months behind. And then, all at once, it gave them their victory. The cold broke. The smell thinned and was gone. The candle flames stood up straight and yellow, and the temperature climbed back to the heat of the Texas night, and the terrible kneeling shape simply was not there anymore. The warriors who had fallen lifted their heads. A great ragged cheer went up. Someone began to sing. Caleb turned to his family with his face shining, sweat and triumph and absolute conviction, and he spread his arms. "You see," he said, breathless, "you see what faith does. It is broken. It is gone. The Lord has driven it out of this house." Micah did not believe it for a second. Neither did his mother. The two of them stood at the back of the room while the warriors embraced and praised, and they looked at each other across all those joyful heads, and Ruth gave the smallest shake of her own. "It didn't leave," she said quietly. "Under the singing, it stepped back. There's a difference, and your father has never once in his life been able to tell the two of them apart." But there was no telling Caleb anything that night. He sent the warriors home glowing. He declared a day of celebration. He went up to bed a conqueror, and the great house settled into a silence that felt, to everyone but him, less like peace and more like the held breath before a deeper plunge. They should not have let Jesse out of their sight. But the night had drained them all, and Jesse had seemed almost himself again in the false dawn of the victory, color back in his face, laughing too loud, drinking to the deliverance. He had clapped Micah on the shoulder. He had said, "See, little brother, Dad was right. Dad is always right." And Micah had been too tired and too uneasy to argue. They had all gone to their rooms. The house had gone dark. It was Eli who woke them. The boy came padding into Micah and Hannah's room a little after 3, and he did not cry. And he did not seem afraid, and that calm was the worst of it.
He stood at the foot of their bed in the dark and he said, "The smiling man isn't gone. He just went to find the one whose name he wrote." He said it the way a child reports that it has started to rain. Micah was up and moving before he was fully awake. The cold met him the instant he opened the door. The river cold, pouring down the hallway from the far end of the house, from the wing where Jesse had his room. The smell was back, thick and sweet and rotten. And under it now was something new, a sound, low and rhythmic and wet, that it took Micah 3 running steps to understand was the sound of a grown man weeping. Jesse's door stood open. The room beyond it was full of fog, real fog, hanging in the freezing air, lit silver by the cross on the highway burning gold through the window. And in the middle of the floor, in the cold and the smell and the silver light, Micah's brother was on his knees. He had not put himself there. Micah understood that at once, from the way Jesse's body strained against it, every muscle locked and shaking, his hands pressed palm to palm in front of him and trembling with the effort of trying and failing to pull them apart. Tears ran down his gray face. His lips moved, but no prayer came out. Only that low animal weeping, and his wide and rolling eyes found his brother in the doorway and held on as though to a rope. Behind him, folding down out of the fog, something tall and thin was beginning, very gently, to kneel. Micah went for his brother. He crossed the freezing room in 3 strides and got his arms around Jesse's chest from behind and pulled. And it was like trying to pull a fence post out of poured concrete. Jesse did not move. The muscles of his back were rigid as stone, his knees rooted to the floor, his folded hands locked at his breast, and the only thing Micah accomplished was to feel, through his brother's shaking body, the terrible downward pressure that held him there, a weight that came from no direction Micah could name.
"Help me," he screamed. "To the house, to anyone. Help me get him up."
The cold thickened. Behind Jesse, the kneeling shape settled fully into place. Close now, its smooth, pale smear of a face lowering toward the back of Jesse's neck as if to share a secret. And Micah, holding his brother, felt the air change character, felt the thing turn some fraction of its attention toward him, and an instinct older than thought told him that if he did not let go, he would be kneeling too. Hannah's voice reached him from the doorway, raw with terror, screaming his name, screaming about the baby. He let go. God forgive him. He let go, and he fell back, and he watched. Jesse stopped weeping. The change came over his ruined face slowly, and it was the most horrible thing of all. More horrible than the cold or the fog or the shape. Because what came over Jesse Vance in his last seconds was peace. The terror drained out of his eyes. The strain went out of his jaw. His trembling stilled. And his mouth, which had been working around prayers that would not come, curved upward at the corners into a small, faint, contented smile. The smile of a man who has at last been shown something wonderful. His eyes lifted to the dark ceiling. His back straightened. His folded hands relaxed against his chest, no longer fighting. And Micah understood that whatever held his brother had stopped needing to hold him, because some part of Jesse had given up and gone willingly down into that awful calm. Then the cold lifted, and the fog thinned, and the smell drew back, and the thing was gone. And Jesse remained exactly as it had left him, kneeling, hands folded, smiling at heaven, not breathing. Micah caught him before he could topple, and the body that had been immovable a moment ago was suddenly only a body, heavy and slack and warm, and it sagged into his brother's arms, and the smile stayed on its face. Micah knelt on the floor of that wrecked silver room, holding his dead brother, and he made a sound he had never made before and never would again. By the time the gray light came up over the highway, the house was full of strangers. The paramedics had nothing to do and knew it. The county officials came and went, polite, careful, deferential to the famous family even now, and a man with a clipboard wrote down the same word a different coroner had written 3 weeks before in a parking lot 2 miles away. Natural, heart failure, in a healthy man of 32, found in a kneeling posture with his hands folded and a smile on his face. No one said the obvious thing, that they had seen this exact death before, that they were looking at it again. No one was permitted to say it. The careful machinery of the living vine was already turning, already managing, already preparing the statement about the tragic sudden loss of the pastor's beloved son. It was Ruth who found the cloth, while the officials murmured, and Caleb stood gray and silent and stunned for the first time in his life. Ruth knelt where her son had died, and she put her hand under the edge of the dresser and drew it out. A square of white linen, folded into quarters. She did not have to open it to know there would be a stain at the center, old and brown, washed out and not washed out. She did not have to open it to know that somewhere on it, in faint, failing ink, would be the name of one of the 31 given back now, the receipt for a debt finally collected. She closed her hand around it, and she did not show it to the men with the clipboards. They took Jesse away as the sun cleared the trees. Hannah had carried Eli upstairs hours before and held him through all of it, his small face pressed into her shoulder, so that the boy did not have to see his father carried out under a sheet. But when they wheeled the gurney through the great room, Eli appeared at the top of the stairs again, the way he always did, and he looked down at the shape beneath the sheet with no surprise at all. He went where the smiling man took him. Eli said softly, "He didn't even fight at the end. He looked happy." Micah sat on the bottom step with his head in his hands and could not answer him. And Ruth Vance stood in the ruin of her family with a dead man's prayer cloth crushed in her fist. And she looked at her husband, who had built all of this, who had filled a 4-inch folder with names and called it harvest, and slept the sleep of the righteous every night of his life. She looked at him for a long time, and the grief in her face hardened, slowly, into something else, something with an edge to it, something that would not bend or break or be talked out of itself ever again. "You did this," she said to him, quietly, not as an accusation, as a fact laid down at last after 34 years of not knowing it out loud. "You planted every one of these seeds, and it is going to take more than Sunday morning to dig them up." They buried Jesse Vance on a Saturday, in front of cameras. Caleb would not have it any other way. There were reporters at the cemetery gates and a live feed for the congregation who could not fit inside. And the casket was white, and the flowers cost a fortune. And the whole terrible spectacle was arranged with the same care the ministry brought to its Easter productions. Micah stood at the graveside in a black suit and watched his father turn his own son's funeral into a service. And he learned that there was no bottom to it, no floor beneath the man, nothing that could not be made into a stage. Because Caleb preached. Of course he preached. He stood over the open grave with his Bible in his hand and his voice strong and his eyes dry. And he told 10,000 grieving people that Jesse was not dead, but promoted, that this loss was a seed, that the family would plant their grief and reap a harvest of souls, that the enemy had meant it for evil, but God would surely use it for good. And then, gently, tenderly, as the cameras rolled, he invited them to honor Jesse's memory with a gift. A breakthrough gift. Online or by text. The number is on your screen. Ruth did not go up to the casket. She sat in the front row in her black dress, and she did not weep, and she did not sing. And when her husband asked the crowd to give, she closed her eyes. and the thing that had hardened in her at Jesse's death set a little further, like concrete curing in the dark. The marriage did not survive that grave, not in any way that mattered.
They still lived in the same house. They still slept, for a while longer, in the same bed. But something between Caleb and Ruth had been cut at the cemetery and would not knit back together, and they both knew it. And they moved through the great house now like two people sharing a hallway in a hotel. He prayed louder. She went quiet. He doubled down on the only gospel he had ever known, scheduling more services, more deliverance, more giving, certain that the breakthrough was always just one more seed away. She began, in her silence, to plan. And in the middle of the two of them, in the cold heart of the haunted house, was the child. Eli's mother had left when the boy was barely 2. A young woman who had married into the machine and could not breathe inside it, and she had not been heard from since. So there was no one to take Eli now. There was only Ruth and the great house on the hill, and Micah and Hannah, who could not bring themselves to leave the boy alone in it, and so stayed on in the guest room week after week, watching their own due date come closer inside those cursed walls. Eli did not cry for his father. That was the thing that broke Ruth's heart most of all. He had lost his mother to absence and his father to the smiling man. And he met both losses with the same unnatural calm. A calm that Ruth was beginning to understand was not peace, but proximity. The boy had been close to the thing for weeks now. He had let it become ordinary. And the longer it stayed, the more of its stillness seemed to settle into him. The new sign came at the end of that first week. Ruth had taken to sleeping in Eli's room, on a daybed by the window, unwilling to leave the boy alone in the dark. She woke a little after 3, the way she always woke now, into the river cold and the sweet rotten smell that meant the thing was near. The fog hung silver in the room. The cross burned gold through the glass, and the boy's bed was empty. She found him in the center of the floor. Eli was kneeling. He was deeply asleep, his eyes closed, his breathing slow and even, and he had come up onto both knees in the cold without ever waking, his small back straight, his face lifted. And as Ruth watched, frozen in the doorway with her heart climbing into her throat, the boy's hands rose on their own from his sides, drifting up through the freezing air, and folded themselves together in front of his chest. Palm to palm, fingers laced, the way a child is taught to fold them, the way the dead had folded them, every one. Ruth did not scream. She had learned, across a lifetime in that house, how not to scream. She crossed the room and she dropped to her own knees in front of her grandson, and she took his small, cold, folded hands in both of hers, and she pulled them apart, gently, and they came apart easily, because he was only a sleeping child, because the thing was not ready for him yet, because it was only showing her what it could do. It was teaching her. That was what she understood, kneeling on that freezing floor, holding her grandson's hands. It had taken her son to break the family. Now it was reaching for the youngest of them, the most innocent, the one whose loss would cost the most, and it was doing it slowly, in front of her, so that she would know there was nothing she could give, no seed she could plant, no service she could hold that would keep it from taking everything down to the last child. She gathered Eli up and carried him back to the bed and held him until the cold withdrew and the smell faded and the gray morning came. And somewhere in those long, dark hours, Ruth Vance stopped grieving and started hunting. She would not wait for her husband to save them. He could not. He never could. There was a locked room down the hall and a 4-inch folder.
and a debt she had spent 11 years refusing to read. In the morning, she went to find the key. The key was not in the locked room. The key to the locked room never is. So Ruth began with Caleb's home office, the ordinary one, the one with the desk and the awards and the photographs, and she went through it the way a thief goes through a house, quietly, methodically, in the empty hours while her husband was at the church performing his grief for the cameras. She did not find the key. She found something worse. In the bottom drawer, under 30 years of tax records and contracts and the small, dirty paperwork of an empire, there was a file box. And in the file box, there were carbon copies of letters the ministry had sent, and Ruth's own hand had written some of them, long ago, in the years before the operation grew too large for the pastor's wife to touch. She had forgotten that. She had made herself forget so many things. And there, near the bottom, dated 11 years back, was a letter she remembered the instant her fingers found it, because she was the one who had signed it. It was addressed to Mr. Daniel Cobb, and it was a brush-off, a form. We are praying for your family in this difficult season. Enclosed, please find an anointed prayer cloth. Plant your seed of faith and trust the Lord for your breakthrough. Signed, with warmth, Ruth Vance. She sat down on the floor of the office with the letter in her lap, and the memory she had spent 11 years burying came up out of the ground all at once, whole and terrible and hers. She had been the one at the door. It was a hot, bright Tuesday, and a man had come up the long drive on foot because his car had already been taken, and he had stood on the steps in a dead man's grief and asked to see the pastor. His boy had been killed, 19 years old, crushed on a Living Vine building site where the safety inspections had been skipped to save money and the paperwork had been quietly made to disappear. The ministry had paid the family a settlement so small it was an insult, on the condition that they sign away the right to ever speak of it. And Daniel Cobb had signed because he was broke and broken and did not understand what he was signing. Too late, he had understood. And he had come to beg the great man of God to tell the truth, to help. Caleb had not come to the door. Caleb never came to the door. He had sent his wife, and Ruth had stood on the steps of her beautiful house in the bright, hot sun, and she had looked into the face of a man whose son her family had killed, and she had given him the rehearsed and gentle line, "The Lord works all things together for good. We will keep you in our prayers." And she had pressed a prayer cloth into his hands, a square of white linen, and she had watched Russell Bishop walk Daniel Cobb back down the drive to the road, and she had gone inside and closed the door and poured herself a glass of iced tea and taught herself, beginning that very afternoon, how not to remember any of it. She had known. That was the thing she could no longer hide from. Sitting on the office floor with the letter in her hands, not vaguely, not in some soft, general way that a wife cannot be blamed for. She had stood in the doorway with the truth looking her in the eye, and she had chosen the house. She had chosen the cars and the cameras and the comfortable lie, and she had sent a grieving father away with a scrap of cloth. And 11 years later, that same father had died on his knees in their parking lot with his hands folded, asking on a slip of paper for the son she had helped to bury. "Give me back my son." She understood the note now. It had never been meant for Caleb alone. For a long time, Ruth sat on the floor and let herself feel the full weight of it, which she had never once allowed herself to do. She was not innocent. She was not the good wife trapped beside a wicked man, the way she had quietly cast herself across 34 years. She was a woman who had looked at evil and found it comfortable, who had kept her silence because her silence was paid for, and the thing in the house had every right to come for her, too. She had a debt of her own. It had her name on it, and it had been patient. The cold came into the office then. The river cold. The sweet, rotten smell. She did not flinch from it. For the first time, she did not push it down or look away. She lifted her head, and she spoke into the empty, cold room, to the thing she could feel gathering at her back, and her voice did not shake. "I know," she said. "I know what I did. I turned him away. I signed the letter. I am as guilty as my husband, and I have been guilty for 11 years, and I am done pretending I am not." The cold held, waiting, as though it had wondered whether she would ever say it. "So here is what is going to happen," Ruth said. "I am going to open that room. I am going to read every name in that folder. I am going to find out exactly what was done and exactly what it will take to set it right. And I am going to do it, all of it, no matter what it costs me, because it is 11 years too late, and it is the only thing left that I can give that is worth anything at all." The smell faded. The cold drew slowly back, and in the silence it left behind, Ruth thought she heard, very faint, very far away, the sound of a man's voice, asking still. It came from Micah 3 nights later, and it taught him the lesson Ruth had already learned. No one in that bloodline was safe. He had told himself, in some quiet corner of his heart, that he would be spared. He had left this place. He had walked away from the money and the machine, rebuilt his faith from the ground up, married a good woman, made an honest life. He was not like his father. He was not like his brother. Surely, he had thought, whatever this was, it would know the difference. It did not care about the difference. He was a Vance, and the debt was a family debt, and his name was on it the same as the rest. The cold woke him at 3. Hannah slept beside him, 8 months along now, her breathing slow, and across the hall, Eli slept under Ruth's watch. Micah opened his eyes into the river cold and the sweet, rotten smell, and he found that he could not move. Not the way Jesse had been unable to move, locked rigid by an outside hand. It was worse than that, and more intimate. The compulsion came from inside him. Some part of his own body wanted to rise. Some part of him wanted, with a terrible, drowsy sweetness, to slip out of the warm bed and go down onto the cold floor and fold his hands and lift his face and let go. He understood, lying there fighting it, exactly how his brother had died. It had not dragged Jesse down in the end. It had offered. It had whispered into the deepest, tired part of a guilty man that he could simply stop, simply kneel, simply give up the unbearable weight of being himself. And Jesse had been so frightened and so hollow that he had said yes. The kneeling was not a punishment. It was a surrender. And the thing could not take a soul that would not, somewhere down at the bottom, agree to be taken. Now it was asking Micah the same question. And it had found, in him, a doorway it could use. The Vance name. The Vance guilt. The 34 years he had spent in this house as a boy, soaking up its sermons, learning its hungers, carrying out of it a wound that had never fully healed. It pressed on all of that. It told him, in no words at all, that he was one of them, that he had always been one of them, that the blood in his veins had built this empire of the dead, and he might as well stop pretending otherwise and come down and rest. His hands began to rise from the blanket. Micah watched them lift in the silver light, drifting up, the fingers beginning to spread and turn toward each other,
and a flat, sweet peace began to pour into him. And it would have been so easy. It would have been such a relief to let the hands meet and fold and be done. He thought of Hannah. He thought of the child that was coming. And he did the only thing he had left, the thing his father had never once done in his whole performing life. He prayed for real. Not the way they prayed in the great room, loud and certain and demanding. He prayed the way a drowning man prays, with nothing in his hands, asking for nothing, claiming nothing. He said, "I am guilty." He said, "My family did this, and I carry their name, and I cannot undo it. And I have no seed to plant and no power to bind you, and nothing to offer at all." He said, "But I will not kneel to you. I will not call this worship. My knees are not yours to take." And then, with the last of himself, he turned his rising, folded hands away from the mockery they were being shaped into and pressed them flat against his own chest, over his hammering heart, and held them there and would not let them fold. "Not my will," he whispered into the cold, "but I am still saying no." The peace turned to fury. The cold became a pressure that bent him double, that pushed him toward the floor with a strength that had nothing sweet in it now. And the smell became unbearable, and the smiling shape rose up at the foot of the bed, close enough that he could have touched it, but it could not finish. That was the thing Micah felt, even at the worst of it, even as his arms shook and his vision went gray. It could press, and it could threaten, and it could terrify, but it could not lay him down, because he would not lay himself down. And the one thing it could not do, for all its patience and all its hunger, was kneel a man who had decided to stand. It broke like a wave against a rock. The pressure peaked and held, and then all at once let go, and Micah collapsed forward onto his hands, gasping, the cold draining out of the room, the smell thinning, the shape unmaking itself back into the dark. Hannah woke to find her husband on all fours on the floor, drenched in sweat, weeping, alive. She got down beside him and held him and asked him what had happened. And Micah could not answer her for a long time. When he could, he said only one thing, the thing he had understood in the depths of it, the thing that changed everything. "It can't take us if we won't go," he said. Jesse went because he gave up, but it can be refused. He looked up at her, his face gray in the dawn, which means Dad can refuse it too. Or he can choose not to. It's going to come down to him choosing. And Hannah, I don't think my father has ever once in his life said no to the thing that was easy. In the end, Ruth did not need the key. She went to the locked door on the morning after the thing came for Micah, and she stood before it in the river cold that always guarded it, and she put her hand flat against the wood. For 11 years, that cold had risen up to turn her away, and every time she had let it. Not now. She leaned her forehead against the door, and she said out loud, "I am not here to hide it anymore. I am here to read it. Let me in." The lock turned over by itself, a small, dry click in the silence. The cold did not lift, but it parted, the way a crowd parts for someone it has been waiting on. The door swung inward, and Ruth Vance walked into the cold heart of her husband's house for the first time in her life. It was a small room, smaller than it had any right to be, windowless, lined floor to ceiling with steel filing cabinets. The smell lived here. The sweet rot was so thick it was almost a taste, and the air was the deep cold of a meat locker, and her breath hung in front of her in clouds as she pulled the chain on the bare bulb overhead. The folder was on the desk. Harvest, in Caleb's handwriting, on the worn tab. 4 inches thick, exactly as she had said.
She made herself open it, and she made herself read. They were not numbers. That was the thing she had braced for and could not be braced for. Each page was a person, a family. There were names and dates and amounts given, and beneath each one, in Caleb's small, careful hand, a note. Planted. That was the word he used. Over and over, down the years, page after page, planted with a date. The widow in Abilene, the young couple and their sick daughter, the retired pastor on his knees in his garden, and among the grown names, threaded all through the decades, the ones that stopped Ruth's heart and would not let it start again. Children. There were children in the folder. A boy of 9 whose parents had given the ministry their college fund to plant against his leukemia. A pair of twins. A girl, 16. And 6 years back, near the front, a young man of 19, Aaron Cobb. Planted in Caleb's hand, with a date that fell 3 days before the building site ever filed its accident report. 3 days before. Ruth read that line over and over. Aaron Cobb had been marked as planted 3 days before the scaffold that killed him ever fell. Her husband had not covered up an accident. There had been no accident. There had been a harvest, scheduled in advance, recorded in advance, in the same hand that signed the Sunday bulletins. She had to sit down. There was a chair, and she sat in it, in the cold, with the folder open in her lap, and her dead family all around her in steel drawers. And she understood at last that the thing she had spent 11 years refusing to know was not that her husband was a hard man, or a greedy man, or even a man who had let people die. It was that her husband had been planting them on purpose, for the harvest, for the church to grow. At the bottom of the folder, beneath the last page, there was the cloth. She knew it the moment she saw it, though she had only held it once, in a dream that had not been a dream, 3 weeks ago in the hallway. Daniel Cobb's prayer cloth, the real one, stiff and dark with old dried blood, folded into quarters, the receipt for the most recent debt collected. And it was warm. In that freezing room, the cloth was warm to the touch, warm as a living hand. And when Ruth lifted it, the smell rose off it so strong that her eyes streamed. And underneath the cloth, where it had lain hidden at the very bottom of the harvest, was a second book. This one was old. Older than the folder. Older than the church. It was a small black ledger, cracked and soft with handling, and the first page was dated 35 years back, in a younger, hungrier version of her husband's hand, in the year before the Living Vine had held its very first service, before there had been a church at all, before there had been anything. Ruth's cold fingers turned to the first entry, and she felt the floor of the world tilt under her, because she understood, before she had even finished reading it, what she was looking at. This was not a record of a man who had stumbled into something dark and been corrupted by it over the years. The first name in this old black book was dated before the church existed. Whatever her husband had done, he had not done it to save the ministry. He had done it to build the ministry. He had started here, in the cold, with this book, with a single planted name, and everything that came after, the stadium and the gold cross and the 10,000 seats and the 100,000 open hands. All of it had grown up out of this one small, terrible seed, exactly as he had always preached. Plant a seed in the ground. The ground takes what it takes. Watch what grows. She lifted her eyes from the book. And in the cold corner of that windowless room, where the bare bulb's light did not quite reach, something tall and thin was kneeling in the dark, its hands folded, its faceless face turned toward her, patient as it had always been, waiting for her to read the first name and understand the whole of it at last. She looked down at the page. She read the name written there in her husband's young hand. The first seed, the one the whole rotten empire had grown from. And Ruth made a sound, alone in that cold room, that no one in the house above her heard.
The first name in the black book was Amos Doyle. Micah did not know it, but Ruth did. And when she carried the old ledger up out of the cold and laid it on the kitchen table in front of her son with her hands still shaking, she told him, in a voice scraped down to nothing, who the first seed had been.
Amos Doyle had been a preacher, a real one, the genuine article. An old man who had run a storefront church on the wrong side of town 40 years ago. 20 folding chairs and a coffee pot, and a faith you could warm your hands at. He had found Caleb Vance as a hungry, angry young man with a gift for talking and nothing to point it at. And he had taken him in, and he had taught him the scriptures, and he had loved him like a son. And then, 35 years ago, old Amos Doyle had died. A heart attack, they said. He was found one morning in the little garden behind the storefront, on his knees, with his hands folded and a smile on his face. And Caleb, his grieving protege, had inherited the congregation, the 20 folding chairs, the whole of it. And within a year, he had moved it to a bigger room. And within 5, he had filled a theater. And the living vine had begun.
He killed him, Ruth said. The man who taught him to pray. That was the first seed. He planted the one person on this earth who ever loved him for free. And he traded a good man's soul for a crowd. And he has been doing it ever since.
Micah sat very still.
Outside the window, the gold cross was beginning to glow against the dusk, the way it had glowed his whole life. And he looked at it now and understood for the first time what it was. Not a beacon, a scarecrow. A bright thing planted in a field to make the harvest look like something holy. Between them, over the long evening, they put the rest of it together. The thing in the house was not Daniel Cobb. It was not any one of the dead. It was older and emptier than that. A hunger that had been in the world a long time before Amos Doyle knelt down in his garden. And what Caleb had done 35 years ago was open a door to it and offer it a meal. That was the covenant. He fed it, and it fed him. Every family the ministry hollowed out, every desperate soul who gave their last dollar and their dying child to plant a seed
was an offering laid on an altar, dressed up to look like a church. The givers thought they were planting faith. They were planting themselves. And the thing took them down onto their knees at the end, hands folded, smiling, made to worship in death the master their pastor had sold them to. But a covenant like that has only one term, and it is always the same term, written small at the bottom, where no hungry young man ever bothers to read it. The harvest, in the end, harvests the farmer. It had taken 35 years, but the debt had come around to its source at last. Daniel Cobb, refusing to stay quiet, coming back and back and back for a son who had been planted, had been the crack in the wall. And through that crack, the thing had finally turned and looked at the house that fed it, and decided that the richest field of all, the one it had been saving, was the family of the man who had planted everyone else. It would take them all. The son who was greedy, the grandson who was innocent, the wife who had stayed silent, and last, when the field was bare, the farmer himself. That was not cruelty. By the logic of the thing, Caleb had made his peace with. It was only harvest. The oldest law there is. Micah put his face in his hands. "He's going to lose," he said. "Whatever he does, he can't outpreach it. He made it." "He doesn't think so," Ruth said. She had seen the flyers that afternoon, on her way out of the church. She had seen the trucks, the lighting rigs, the staging, because Caleb Vance, faced with the deaths of his son and the haunting of his house and the slow unraveling of everything, had reached, as he always reached, for the only weapon he had ever trusted: scale. He had announced a night of breakthrough, a single, citywide, all-night service, the largest the ministry had ever held. The stadium opened to its full 30,000, broadcast to 1 million more. Every prayer warrior and every camera and every open hand the living vine could muster, all of it aimed at the darkness that had come against the anointed house of God. He would not hide from it. He would not confess to it. He would stand on the biggest stage of his life in front of the whole watching world, and he would bind it and rebuke it and outshout it and plant the largest seed any congregation had ever planted and force heaven to answer. He had no idea, Ruth said quietly, that he would be standing on an altar he built himself in front of 30,000 people, offering the one seed it had been waiting 35 years to harvest. Micah lowered his hands. "When?" he said. "3 nights from now," said Ruth. And then her voice changed, and the iron came back into it, the thing that had set at Jesse's graveside and would not bend again. "We are not going to be in that stadium begging it to leave, Micah. That has never once worked, and it never will. There is only one thing in all of this that the thing cannot stand against, and your father will never do it, because it is the one thing he has spent his whole life selling a counterfeit of." "What?" Micah said. "The truth," said Ruth, out loud, "and everything given back." The night of the great service, 30,000 people filled the stadium, and not one of them knew they had come to a feeding. Micah stood at the back of the floor, near the camera platforms, and watched it begin. He had not been able to stop his father. No one could stop Caleb Vance on a night like this, with the lights and the cameras and the largest crowd of his life roaring his name into the dark. Ruth was not there. Ruth was 2 hours away by then, in a different town, knocking on a different door, doing the only thing that had any hope in it. So Micah had come alone, to be near his father at the end, because whatever the man had done, he was still his father, and Micah could not make himself stay away. Caleb took the stage at full power. He looked, in the white light, like a man who had never doubted anything in his life. He told the multitude that the enemy had come against them, that the anointed were under attack, that tonight they would push the darkness back into the pit it had crawled from. He called for the largest offering in the ministry's history, a seed to break every curse, and the buckets went out, and 30,000 hands opened, and the money came down like rain. Then he raised his Bible over his head, and he began to bind and to rebuke, and the crowd lifted their voices with him, 30,000 strong, a wall of sound that shook the rafters, and the thing came up into all of it like a swimmer rising through water toward the light. Micah felt the cold first, impossibly, in a stadium packed with bodies under stage lamps. He saw his breath. On the great screens above the stage, the image of his father's face began to stutter and distort, the feed crawling with interference. The smell rolled across the floor, sweet and rotten, and people near him began to gag and look around, confused, the worship faltering in patches like a field going dark under moving cloud. Then the kneeling began. It started in the front rows and spread outward in a slow ring, and it was the most terrible thing Micah had ever seen. Worse than the room, worse than his brother, because there were so many of them. People sank to their knees by the hundreds, by the thousands, hands folding, faces lifting, eyes rolling closed. And at first, the ones still standing thought it was the spirit moving, thought it was revival, and they cheered. Then the cheering changed, because the kneeling ones were smiling, all of them, the same wide, flat smile, and they were not breathing right. And the ring of them was spreading toward the back of the stadium like cold across a pane of glass. This was the harvest. Caleb had gathered the largest crowd of his life and opened all their hands at once. And the thing he had fed for 35 years had finally been brought a feast worthy of it. Sitting down to eat in front of a live audience of 1 million more. On the stage, Caleb faltered. For the first time in his public life, the great voice broke. He had felt the cold reach the platform. He looked out over his congregation, his 30,000, and he saw them going down in their smiling rows, and some animal part of him understood at last what he was looking at, what he had always been looking at every Sunday of his life. He tried to keep preaching. He commanded it, in the name above every name, to flee. His voice cracked and thinned and rose toward panic, and the thing did not flee. Because you cannot rebuke the master of a house you yourself invited in. And Caleb Vance's authority, the authority he had trusted for 35 years, turned to ash in his mouth in front of the whole watching world. The shape rose up behind him on the stage. It came up out of the floor, lights tall and thin and wrong. And on the giant screens above, where 10,000 people had watched their pastor's face glow for years, there was now Caleb at the front, and the kneeling shape behind him, lowering its smooth, pale face toward the back of his neck. Caleb felt it. He spun, and there was nothing there. And he spun back, and the crowd that was still standing began at last to scream and to run. And the broadcast cut to black across 1 million screens. And Caleb Vance went down onto his knees on his own stage. Not all the way. Not the way the others had gone. He fought it, the way Jesse had fought, the way Micah had fought, his knees buckling against his will, his hands rising toward each other through the freezing air. But he did not finish. The thing held him there, halfway, kneeling and not yet folded, in the wreck of his great event. And Micah understood, shoving through the panicking crowd toward the stage, that it was not taking his father. Not yet. It was showing him. It had brought him down in front of the world to let him feel the weight of the debt, to let him taste exactly what he had sold so many others into. And then it set him loose, all at once, so that he sprawled forward onto the stage on his hands, gasping, alive, broken. His empire screaming and trampling itself in the dark all around him. Micah reached him as the house lights came up on a catastrophe. His father was on all fours, gray, shaking, his perfect hair hanging in his eyes, and he looked up at his son with an expression Micah had never once seen on that face in 28 years. He was afraid. "It's real," Caleb whispered. The crowd roared and fled around them. It was always real. "Micah, what do I do?" "For the love of God, son, tell me what I do." And 2 hours away, in a small house with a porch light on, Ruth Vance knocked on the door of Sarah Cobb. Sarah Cobb opened the door 6 inches and looked out at the old woman on her porch with the flat, tired eyes of someone who has already lost everything there is to lose. She knew the face. Everyone in 3 states knew the Vance family. And for one moment, Ruth saw the door begin to close, and she did not blame her. And she put her hand against it, gently, and she said the only thing that could possibly have kept it open. "I came to tell you the truth about your brother," Ruth said, "and about your father. I have spent 11 years helping my husband hide it, and I am done. May I come in?" They sat at a small kitchen table under a bare hanging bulb, and Ruth told her everything. She did not soften it. She did not arrange it to make herself look better, the way her whole family had arranged everything their whole lives. She told Sarah that Aaron had not died in an accident, that he had been marked in a black book 3 days before the scaffold ever fell, that the inspections had been skipped and the paperwork buried, and the family bought into silence with a settlement designed to insult. She told her about the folder labeled Harvest and the children in it. She told her that Daniel had come to the great house begging for the truth, and that it had been Ruth herself who turned him away with a scrap of cloth and a rehearsed lie. "I sent your father back down that driveway," Ruth said, and her voice did not break, because she had decided it was not her turn to be comforted. "I had the truth in my hands, and I chose my house over your family. Your father died on his knees in our parking lot asking for a son we took from him, and I am the one who taught myself to forget him. I am not here to ask you to forgive me. You do not owe me that, and I did not come for it." Sarah Cobb sat very still. Her hands were flat on the table. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and shaking and full of a grief 11 years deep. "Then why did you come?" she said. "To give it back," Ruth said. She put it all on the table between them. A copy of the black ledger with Aaron's name in Caleb's hand and the date that proved it. The settlement papers, a list of every account, every property, every dollar that Micah was at that very hour handing to a reporter and to the Attorney General's office, so that the whole rotten field of it would be turned up to the light at last, and there would be no more hiding it, not for the church, not for the family, not for anyone. And a deed, the great house on the hill, signed over, because it had been built on Aaron and on Amos Doyle, and on 30 years of the planted. And Ruth would not sleep another night under its roof. "It will not bring them back," Ruth said. "Nothing will. But you will have the truth, and you will have what is owed, and the world will know what your father knew and could not make anyone believe. It is 11 years late, and it is not enough, and it is everything I have." For a long moment, Sarah Cobb did not move. Then she lowered her face into her hands, and the grief that had been frozen in her for 11 years finally cracked and ran, and she wept, not for the money and not for the house, but because someone had finally said it out loud. Her brother had not been careless. Her father had not been crazy. They had been telling the truth the whole time, and now, at last, they had been believed. And 2 hours away in the emptying stadium, something shifted. Micah felt it as he came off the phone with the reporter. The cold that had filled the great room began, very slowly, to thin. Among the rows of kneeling, smiling figures, here and there, a change came. The oldest of the dead, the long planted, seemed to settle. Their lifted faces lowered. The wide, flat smiles eased into something quieter, almost like sleep. It was not a healing. They were still gone, and nothing could undo that. But the long debt that had bound them to that altar was being paid in the only coin it had ever answered to, which was truth, spoken aloud, and restitution laid down. And one by one, as the lie that held them was unmade in the world above, the wronged began, at last, to rest. Ruth felt it too, at Sarah's table, in the warmth that came back into the room. She knew, the way she had known so many things in that house, that something long held had begun to let go. But not all of it, not the heart of it, because as Ruth drove home through the dark, And as Micah walked out of the wrecked stadium into the screaming lights of the news cameras, both of them carried the same cold certainty. The one piece of the thing that confession and restitution had not touched and could not touch. The debt of the planted could be paid by those willing to tell the truth. But the man who had planted them had not told the truth. He had asked, on his knees, "What do I do?" He had not said, "I am sorry." He had not said, "I did it." He had not given back a single thing. The thing still had its claim on Caleb Vance. It had always had its claim on Caleb Vance. And it was waiting for him now, patient as ever, in the cold heart of a house that no longer belonged to him, to see whether the man who had spent 35 years selling a counterfeit of grace could reach, even at the very end, for the real thing. Ruth did not think he did. She had been married to him for 34 years. They found Caleb in the great room of the house that was no longer his, sitting alone in the dark with a bottle and the wreckage of everything. The news had broken by then. The ledger was in the hands of reporters. The Attorney General had opened a file. By morning, his name, which had filled stadiums and floated in gold above the interstate for 35 years, would be a curse in every mouth in the country. He sat in the ruins of it, and for the first time in his life, he had nothing to perform, no crowd to lift, no camera to find. And what was left of Caleb Vance in that empty chair was a small and frightened old man. Ruth knelt in front of him, and Micah stood at her shoulder, and they offered him the only thing that could still be offered. "There is a way out," Ruth said. "We found it. It is the same way that set the others free tonight. It is not a sermon, and it is not a seed, and it is not something you can shout down or buy or spin. You confess it, Caleb, all of it, out loud, in your own name, to the world and to God, with nothing held back and nothing arranged. You say, 'I did this.' You give back everything that is left, and you throw yourself on a mercy you never once preached honestly in your life. The real one, the one that was always there for the asking, even for you, even now." She took his cold hands in hers. "It is real," she said. "The grace is real, Caleb. That is the thing you sold a counterfeit of for 35 years. And the terrible joke of it is that the true one would have cost you nothing but your pride, and you could have had it any day you wanted. You can have it right now. The door is open. I am begging you, walk through it." For a long moment, Caleb Vance looked at his wife, and something moved behind his eyes. Some last flicker of the boy that old Amos Doyle had loved for free. And Micah dared, for one breath, to hope. Then Caleb spoke, and the hope died. "If I confess," he said slowly, "then it was all a lie. Everything. The whole life. There is no great man of God. There is just a murderer in a nice suit." He shook his head, and his voice gathered the old strength, the platform strength, the strength that had never once in 35 years bent to the truth. "No, no, I built something. 100,000 people met God in my house. That has to count. That has to be worth something. I am not going to stand in front of the world and say I am nothing. I would rather—" He did not finish it. But the cold was already coming up into the room. The river cold, the sweet, rotten smell. Because the thing had been waiting all along to hear exactly this. The one answer it had known he would give. He would rather anything than be nothing. He had been offered the real grace, free and open and sufficient even for him, and he had looked at the price of it, which was only his pride, and he had decided it cost too much. Ruth let go of his hands. She had been married to him for 34 years, and she had known, and still it broke something in her that would never mend. "You could have been saved," she whispered. "It wasn't God who wouldn't save you, Caleb. God held the door for you to the very last second. You're the one who wouldn't walk through it." The cold filled the room. Caleb felt it now. And at the very end, the fear cracked his face wide open, and he understood, far too late, that the mercy had been real, and he had said no to it, and that there would not be another offer. He tried to stand. He could not. His knees were already buckling, his body folding down toward the floor against everything left in him. And this time, the thing did not stop halfway. Caleb Vance went down onto his knees in the dark of his lost house. His back straightened, his face lifted. His hands rose and pressed themselves together, palm to palm, fingers laced, the way a child folds them, the way the planted had folded them, every one. And the smile spread across his face, the wide, flat, contented smile of a man being shown something at last. Except that behind it, his eyes were screaming, and they stayed screaming, even as the breath went out of him and did not come back. Even as the cold lifted and the smell faded, and the thing, sated at the end of its long harvest, finally and fully let go of the house on the hill. Micah caught his mother as her legs gave way. They knelt together on the floor a few feet from the body, and neither of them spoke for a long time. There was no triumph in it. There was justice, hard and clean and complete. The harvest come home to the farmer at the last. But there was no triumph, because a man does not have to be good for his death to break the hearts of the people who loved what he might have been. And upstairs, for the first time in many weeks, Eli slept through the whole night without rising, without kneeling, without folding his small hands in the cold. The thing was gone from the boy. It was gone from Hannah and the child she carried. It was gone from Ruth and from Micah. The debt paid, the field finally bare. The house was only a house again. But Ruth Vance knelt by her husband's body until the sun came up, and she did not feel free. She felt, instead, the beginning of the long work of living with all of it, which, she was learning, was a different thing entirely. The living vine did not survive the autumn. It came apart the way a great rotten tree comes apart, slowly and then all at once. The investigations opened. The ledger spoke for itself. The faithful drifted away in stunned and grieving thousands, and the stadium went dark, and the second campus was never built. And one cold gray morning, a crew came with a crane and took down the 30-foot cross that had floated in gold above the interstate for 35 years. They laid it on a flatbed truck and drove it away. And after that, you could pass that exit at night and see only the dark where it used to be. And most people who passed it had already begun to forget that it had ever been there at all. Sarah Cobb got her name back. Both of them, her brothers and her father's. The settlement was undone. The truth was entered into the record, and the small house with the porch light was joined, in time, by the deed to a great empty mansion on a hill, which she did not want and could not live in, and quietly sold, giving most of what it brought to the other families in the folder, the ones who were still living, the planted who had survived. It was not justice. There is no justice that gives a brother back or a father. But it was the truth, standing upright in the daylight at last. And that was a thing Sarah Cobb had stopped believing she would ever see. The survivors left the house on the hill and did not look back. Ruth went with Micah and Hannah, 2 states away, to the small, ordinary life Micah had built and nearly lost. And there, in the early winter, Hannah's child was born. A girl, healthy and loud and furious at the cold, bright world. And they named her after no one in the Vance family at all.
They gave her a plain new name with no weight on it and no debt behind it. And when Ruth held her granddaughter for the first time, she wept. Not from grief, for once, but from something she had almost forgotten the shape of.
Eli came back to himself slowly. The way the ground comes back after a hard frost, the unnatural calm left him by degrees. He stopped drawing the kneeling man. He began again to be afraid of ordinary things. The dark, thunderstorms, the deep end of the pool, and his family rejoiced over every small, healthy fear, because each one was a sign that the stillness was leaving him, that the thing that had made him quiet had finally let go of his small hands. He would carry it. They all would. You do not stand that close to that kind of dark and walk away clean.
But he was a child again, and children, given love and time and truth, are built to heal. That was the thing Ruth held on to in the months that followed, as she did the long, slow work of living with all of it. The truth had cost them everything, and it had also been the only thing that saved them. Faith had not been a lie. That was what she came to understand, sitting in a small church in a small town where nobody knew her name, an ordinary church with worn carpet and bad coffee and no gold anywhere in it. The grace her husband had spent his life selling a counterfeit of was real.
It had been real the whole time. It had held the door open for him to the very last second of his life. And it had gathered up her own guilty, broken family when they finally turned and walked toward it instead of away. The mercy had always been there for the asking. The horror had never been God. The horror had been the human heart, her husband's and her own. The greed that could look at a grieving father and feel only inconvenience. The pride that would rather be damned than be small. She made her peace with most of it. With the rest, she learned to live. But there were nights, late autumn nights, a year on, when the air went cold and still in that particular way, and Ruth would wake at 3 in the morning in her small, quiet room, with her heart already pounding before she knew why. And she would lie there in the dark and listen. Sometimes there was nothing, and sometimes, very faint, very far, there would be a smell, sweet and spoiled, like old flowers in dirty water, drifting in from somewhere that did not exist. And once, only once, on the coldest night of the year, there came a sound at her door. A slow, soft, patient knocking. 3 times, and then a pause, and then 3 times again. Ruth Vance did not get up. She did not open the door. She lay in the dark, and she folded her hands the way a child folds them, the way the dead had folded them, except that she folded hers in a true prayer, a real one, an honest and humble and frightened prayer. And she held them that way, and she did not answer the knocking. And after a while, it stopped. She never knew what it was, whether it was some last cold remnant of the thing never fully sated, circling the edges of a family it could no longer touch, whether it was the debt of some name still unpaid, some folder her husband had kept that no one had ever found, whether it was nothing at all, only an old woman's haunted heart, knocking from the inside. She never knew. Out at the dark exit off the interstate, where the gold cross used to burn, the cicadas still go silent sometimes, all at once, the way they do when something moves through the grass that should not be there. And the people who pass do not hear it. And the door in the small, quiet house stays closed.